So it's been a few years, and I have slowly started to let go of the idea that I could have done anything differently to prevent the event that completely ended up changing the way that I see life and the way that I was living life. But it doesn't mean that I still don't obsess about it. So even though I created a very general intro video, which I will link for your reference, and it just talks about, the channel and it gives you the headlines of my story, I thought that it would probably be much more helpful to create a much more intimate story time video that takes you through the event or the stroke that I suffered, and also highlights what the big takeaways and learnings were. It's easy to say, yes, okay, I suffer this really big event, but it's hard to kind of really say anything else without kind of talking about how transformative that event was. And I think that that's really important, especially for the kind of channel and platform that I'm slowly trying to build. And I want to make sure that's really important and that I'm much more human than this kind of packaged product that I've started to kind of work on trying to create, because I think it's a little more imperfect than that. And I think it's really important that that kind of comes through. Anyway, as if you haven't seen any of my other videos, I think I've referenced them in some of them, that I did have a stroke. But to provide a little bit of foundational content, information, when it happened, it was the fall of 2017, and I was where I would say, and is exactly where I wanted to be in my life at that time. I was really established I was getting to this point where I was getting really established in my career. I had, the fancy job with the fancy title. I had a really wonderful boyfriend who is now my husband. I had a beautiful, shiny apartment. I had a brand new car. Like, literally, I couldn't imagine life to have been. And I was training for like my third half marathon. So I was, to add icing to the cake, I was also at the peak of my health. Like, I literally couldn't have asked and dreamed for anything else. And I guess, and I think when I was feeling at my downest, I kind of assumed and said, you know what, well, things were going way too well. Like, that was going to have to completely be shaken up. And that's such a pessimistic way of seeing things, but that's what headspace I was in as I was recovering. But I do think it's really important to kind of illustrate just how completely at peace and thrilled I was with life. I worked a lot. I had, stressors and things like that. But, those were trade-offs that I was willing to make for the kind of life that I was living, because everything else was just so great that it was worth it to deal with kind of like the irritating things. So it's really hard to kind of have all of that stuff be exactly where it needed to be, that things just kind of drastically pivot. And when I mean drastically, I mean very abruptly. I had a great full day. I had a date night with my boyfriend, and life was where I needed. Like, I can't say that enough, because it's really important to kind of understand how violently and how quickly things can just change. So, I had gone to sleep after a long day, and I had a lot more work to do, and I think I had stayed up till like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. doing work, and it's the kind of price that I paid for the kind of office job I had, and the kind of demand and the kind of level that I was at. And so I was like, it's not that big a deal. It just comes with the territory. And I had put in all of these hours and didn't think anything too much about it because that's stuff that I had done before. But when I passed out, I set my alarm so that way it would make sure to wake me up, because going to bed so late, it was quite likely that I would even potentially sleep in, right? And I didn't want to miss some meetings. I even had a couple of really big appointments that I had to be at the office, and so I got up with the alarm. And when I got up, the first thing that I really noticed was that I had what had to be probably the worst headache in my life. And what was really crazy is that, we all get headaches and things like that. But this was it was kind of like New Year's times 10. And I didn't even drink over the night before. And so it didn't make any sense that I would have such a throbbing headache. But I was like, you know what, maybe I've just been putting in too many hours and I've been stretching myself to the max. And this is just, this just comes with the territory, but screw it. It's getting in my way. I'll take some aspirin. I'll sleep it off a little bit. Maybe I can skip my first meeting of the morning and I can sleep it off a little bit, but I've got to get to the office because nothing else can really else be wrong, And so that's what I did. And so I thought that was all I needed to do. And in hindsight, I probably, because I was feeling so bad and because I wasn't used to really being sick of any type of fashion, I didn't know enough to kind of really listen to the fact that that pain and that throbbing feeling that I was feeling was something was already going wrong. And I probably, and who knows, if I had heeded that sensation, maybe, I could have figured out things a little sooner than I did, but I didn't. And so, and that's something I will have to own. And even though that's happened, I've stopped beating myself up and stopped kind of assuming that it was my fault, that something completely didn't work and went wrong. Anyway, I say this to say that, I slept it off for a couple hours and, I'd send an email to my job and I said, look, I'll be there a little late. I just have a really bad headache and things like that. But I try to go to sleep and I turn down all the blinds because I figured that I just didn't need so much sunshine coming into my bedroom. These are all things, and I had taken the aspirin. These are all little things I thought were going to be enough to kind of mitigate what I was feeling. But, a few hours went past and, my short little nap, the aspirin, nothing was working. And so that was when I called my boyfriend. I said, you know what? I was like, I didn't go into work. I have this really, really bad headache and it won't go away. And it's really, really getting to me. And he was like, you know what? Babe, you don't sound all that great. And I remember thinking what are you talking about? I'm fine. And I don't know, maybe as I think about it now, maybe that was at that point, those were the effects of the stroke, because I clearly in my head knew what I was saying, but it wasn't sounding that way to him. And so, but anyway, he told me I'll come over after I'm done with my last meeting, but just rest. Don't cancel your meetings for the afternoon. You're not well enough to go to work. I'm not sure what's going on, but it doesn't make sense for you to just kind of blow this off. And we want to make sure that things aren't worse. And I was like, oh, it's fine. Maybe it'll be fine by the end of the day, by the time you come over. And so, nothing is happening. I'm sleeping, vegging. I got a couple of texts and things from work or whatever, but I'm not really acknowledging them. And that's not like me because I was such a workaholic at that point but that was just how badly I was feeling. And so, by the time he comes over later in the evening, and I'm trying to walk towards the door, but I'm not able to stand up very well. I'm feeling a little shaky. And he was like, babe, I'll call your doctor, but I think I'm just going to take you to the hospital. And so he did. He called my doctor. My doctor's like, yeah, you know what? Take her there. It doesn't sound like things are very great. You don't want her to just kind of ignore this. I have some theories, but I don't know. And let's just get her to the hospital, and I'll call ahead and tell them that you're coming. And so he did. And so we got there in a couple minutes. And so that actually got me kind of like bumped to kind of see the doctors and have them go in and run all these tests. And so it was probably the time, probably a good couple hours, but as they were getting me through running the test and getting some of the results. And it wasn't until the doctor kind of comes in and tells me that, based on their preliminary tests, that, not only do they have to keep me overnight, but that, that I had suffered a stroke, and as he had said that, and he had started asking me a couple questions, but the only words that I heard was that I had a stroke. And I was like, wait, what? Like, how in the world does that happen? And the funny thing is that I was just very, very, I was very much in denial, because I was like, wait, life is as perfect as I need it to be. I didn't have a stroke. Like, that doesn't make any type of sense. But, there he is with all that paperwork and the tests, and he's going through all the logic and all of the things that they found. And I just barely heard half of it, I'll be honest. Like, because at this point, with those words, my life has completely turned upside down. And I think what's really upsetting is that I was almost kind of more fixated with what an inconvenience it was, as opposed to the fact that I was still living, the extents and all that. Like, I wasn't focused on the other things that probably really should have mattered at that point. I was more like, oh man, I missed all these meetings at work, and it was so misguided, but that was just how in denial I was that the event that I lived through had happened. And I think as he went through all of his explanations, he told me that I needed to spend the night in the hospital, or at least a bare minimum one night. But, he was thinking that it would need to be a couple nights, because they wanted to make sure that they ran every different type of test, and that I would be meeting all the different types of therapists that you can meet. Because when you have that kind of stroke, they're checking for all these different levels of functionals, like occupational little things. Can I walk down the stairs by myself, and can I walk down the hall, and how are my motor skills, and can I identify these kinds of shapes, and what's my speech? And so there was like a parade of different types of doctors that were coming into my room to kind of run all these diagnostics and to take me through all these additional tests. And the next couple days were just kind of exhausting. Now, I will say that one of the things that I did start to kind of notice, and one of the doctors had flagged to me, was that they noticed that I was kind of experiencing what they called kind of like bouts of aphasia. And aphasia, and I'll put a link as to what aphasia is, but that's kind of when, you're going through either long patches or awkward kind of construction in dialogue and speaking. So things that may have sounded a certain kind of way to me either were not coming out naturally or smoothly, and I was kind of just struggling. And I'm not talking about like little hiccups when you're in the middle of communicating and talking, but I'm talking about like things that were genuinely affecting smooth delivery of conversation. Now, as a person that works in like, the kind of marketing and communications fields that I've worked in, that was really life altering for me to hear, because what I've always relied on is my ability to be able to communicate and deliver. And that wasn't happening. And I was like completely hysterical, but I still thought that I was living in a really, really bad nightmare. And I think that what's really, really mind blowing is the fact that I was continuing, I still continue to process how fixated I was on what an inconvenience and what a challenge and how disruptive this was. I still hadn't even reconciled the fact that, you know what, that the doctors were telling me that, you know what, although there are some impacts and there are things that you're going to need to do, you're going to actually be fine. And they were mind blown that for what they perceived to be pretty extensive trauma, it wasn't affecting my level to communicate and engage, and that a lot of skills hadn't been affected. My motor skills weren't affected. Like all those other things that are often experienced and tied and associated with a stroke were not impacted. And, you know, but even though that's good news, it wasn't sinking in. And I think that that's just kind of speaks to the level of kind of like shock and denial that I would probably even argue that I was experiencing. But anyway, so after those several days, they start kind of formulating their diagnostics and assessments of what they think I'm going to need to do, and the kind of follow-up therapy sessions I was going to need to go, just to make sure that they were staying on and that I was staying on top of like the actual recovery, you know, and that I wasn't kind of just going ahead and abruptly just kind of being like, okay, well, I'm fine and that's enough. But there were some things that I could do to kind of expedite some things, like to fix the bouts of aphasia that I was dealing with, and to probably start working on memory, because that was something that they were worried was potentially impacted, and little things like that. So there were things that they were like, you know what, if you start doing this now, then you're going to be on top of it and course correct it and fix it, and basically give your brain an ability to kind of restretch it so it remembers what it knows how to do. And I think that was the way that one of the doctors had described it. And I thought that was a good analogy. He goes, you have all the tools, but now we just need to make sure that your brain is remembering that you still have all of them. So just go and you'll be fine. And just because of based on the diagnostics, you don't need to go to as many places and as many therapy sessions. And so they were just trying to assure me of that, but none of that was any of the stuff that I really wanted to hear, because all I wanted to hear is that I was eventually going to be fine. And so after all of the days that I spent in the hospital, and I finally was discharged, and I went home, and I spent the next several days in like my pajamas and upset, crying and stressed that my life and my career was going to be over. And, you know, my job had called in several times and sent me big baskets of flowers and food and things to cheer me up, because, you know, they had heard, and I had shared with, you know, the senior leader, so they knew why I was going to have to be out of the office for a little while, because my doctors had said, look, don't go rushing to the office even though you feel amazing. And then you know, they actually wanted me to take like, you know, a lot longer than I did originally. I kind of went and took, I think I went in for like a week, and then my doctor, I think somehow there, you know, when I said it to the staff, I was like, hey, I'm here, and I popped in, and they're like, no, where's your doctor's note? And I was like, oh, I guess I got to get one of those. And then when I went to my doctor to get the note, they're like, no, you couldn't just go back in after a couple of weeks. We need you to take a couple of months, you know, to just recoup and give your body a chance to heal and recover. And so I was like, oh, well, that's really inconvenient. What the heck am I going to do? I have all this work that needs to get done. And again, me fixated on the work. And it was such a horrible way to kind of think about the fact that that was the only thing that mattered at that time. But it did. And I'm just checking my notes to make sure I'm not leaving anything out. And thankfully I'm staying on track, which is fabulous. But yeah, so anyway, I knew that I was going to have to kind of do a little bit of configuration and readjusting, but my job was at that point, and the doctor reminded me, my job was to focus on my recovery. And so I was like, okay, fine, I guess I'm just going to have to deal with it. So I started going to my therapy sessions, and I was seeing a speech therapist primarily was what they said that they wanted me to do. And speech therapists help with like memory and cognition and those other things. And it was really humbling because I was doing some of these things that I thought were completely ludicrous. And I was like, why in the world? I'm just reaching out for my tea. So I was like, why in the world am I doing these silly puzzles, and how are they going to help me be any better at my job, and how are they going to help me improve? And I was so obsessed with like the actual like pieces and what I was doing, as opposed to how in the world this repetition was really helping my brain, because I didn't want to understand that, because I was still bitter. I was upset because even though I hadn't led a perfect life to get to that point, but life was really wonderful for me. And so why would that have to change? And it was really defeating to kind of accept the fact that like now I have this wrinkle that I'm in my life that I'm going to have to learn how to deal with. And I wasn't really ready for all that. And so I went through, a few months of kind of like the training and the therapy. And it got to the point that my therapy, after a couple months actually, I was able to start kind of scaling back and just going a little less frequently. But I think what was really overwhelming to me was the gradual evolution of my feelings, because when I started therapy, I was the least willing patient. I was like, this is silly, this is difficult. Like, oh, bless my therapist, because she was my lead therapist. She was so patient with me and always educating me on what her work was supposed to help me do. And even to keep me engaged, she would even give me real life examples from my day-to-day work to excite me, because I was like, this isn't going to be helpful unless I'm doing exactly what I'm going to be doing at the office. And that was kind of like the arrogance of me. And so I had to kind of, that I was embracing and still holding on to. And part of it was the anger emotionally that I was really clinging to. But in any case, I think that as time started to pass and I started to see improvement in things like my aphasia, where it was completely starting to fade as I was doing a lot of this practicing and working, and I was getting and I was stretching muscles, and because, like my doctor said, because my brain knew how to do this, it was just a matter of, oh well, you know how to do this, and it was just speeding up. And it was wonderful to kind of start seeing that evolution, but it wasn't immediate, and it did have to happen in a few months. And as the months started to kind of pass, I noticed a couple of things. Like emotionally, I started to kind of slowly, and I'm going to use the word slowly a couple of times, to let go of my general anger and frustration. But I also started to kind of see how what I was living through and what the training was doing to help me get back to a version of myself. And I think that, with that time, I I'll be honest and say that I needed that time, because I wasn't ready to see that immediately, because I was so resentful and angry. And what's interesting is that it was with that time that I started to kind of not only see the benefits, but then when I started to kind of find like the peace inside me to kind of start to be grateful that it wasn't as severe, because, you know, in the therapy that I was doing and meeting other patients, realizing that there were so many different extremes of stroke impact. And I was still just so obsessed with the unimportant details, as opposed to just kind of basking in the beauty and the reality that I was not only alive, but that I had the option. You know what I mean? And not just the option for the training, but that I was able to recover, you know, because that's not, unfortunately, always going to be a reality, depending on the extremity. And, you know, I think that it's saying that out loud, I think is continues to remain a trigger and a reminder for me, because I need to kind of be very, very cognizant and mindful of the fact that it could have turned out a completely different way. And I have to keep, even though I know that now with a lot of clarity, and I'm sharing that with you, it could have not gone that way. And I have to continue to remember that, so I don't remain angry and resentful at myself for what I didn't do, or for any of the time that I may have potentially lost, because that was how I was seeing things. I lost time, or I'm no longer at work, or, you know, like I was seeing it, the superficial impact, as opposed to what this time and this recovery from stroke survival looks like, you know. And I wasn't focused on like the rainbow at the end of the pot of gold, right? Or yeah, I guess that's the expression. I'm not sure, I guess. But, you know, I wasn't focused on the good, on the greater good, that, you know what, that once I'm able to get through this temporary, awkward time frame, then I will have a stronger version of me, because not only was I able to live through such a challenging, life-altering event, but I'm going to be fine and better. And that's real. Like that's fact. And I had to kind of be very, 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 very like coached into that, you know, like this is the kind of thing that I was having a lot of conversations with friends and doctors, but I think it was something that I had to kind of go through, you know, to really start to see it. I think you kind of have to have the experiences and the people around you and the evidence, at least in this particular circumstance and specific to this particular issue. I had to be guided to all that. I think I used the word coach, but I had to be guided to all of that by living through the experience, having the time pass, getting reminders from people, getting doctors, reports. Like I had it to kind of be guided to all that, to kind of start to feel the validation and the understanding and the acceptance for that. And the reality is that I think people can tell you whatever they want to tell you when you are at the beginning throes of an experience, when you are feeling that pain. And when I was crying in my hospital bed, and when I was sitting alone in my apartment in my pajamas and wouldn't leave outside because I was scared and was petrified of about what this could have meant if what if I can't go back to the work that I do, and what if I can't be the version of me before this? What am I going to do? And I didn't like the way that that felt, and it scared the daylights out of me. Anyway, because this is already getting a little long, and I kind of want to wind this down a little bit. But I say all this because, as I reflect on all this and the journey itself, like the experience, as I reflect on all of these experiences and the fact that I am ultimately fine and have made a full recovery and am unbelievably grateful and thankful to have gone through the journey, even if it took me a while to kind of get through all of it. And there were a million lessons throughout this journey, some of which I will make videos for the channel, so you'll be able to find those. There are some master, what I like to call kind of like headlines that came out of the entire experience that I went through, which is these major ones. I really needed to be much more focused on taking care of myself and self-care. And I know that the term self-care gets used around a lot, especially on YouTube, I've noticed. But I realized that listening to my body and all the cues that it's always giving me is mission critical. And like I've started to let go of the idea and the pain of like, man, what if I had gone to the hospital when I felt that headache, like, and I can't think like that anymore because that doesn't matter. So the lesson and the takeaway should now be at this point is that now, you know what, as opposed to ignoring feelings that just don't feel right, I'm going to make sure that I listen to it to take care of myself. The same thing goes to allowing my body to kind of get rest when it needs it, heal and whatever. And you don't realize that we are so good at neglecting ourselves for what we perceive to be the greater good or something else. And life is too short to be neglecting yourself. So after going through that ordeal, I decided that no more. So I just need to be much better at myself. And the same goes with the kind of career choices I make and why I decide to stay at a certain job, why I decide to leave. Like I just decided that I was going to start prioritizing myself. At the end of the day, it is about taking care of myself and making sure, because you know what, now that I've been given a second chance, I'm not going to blow that. So my job is only to do whatever it's going to take to make sure that this version of myself is as satisfied and as healthy and as fully, completely self-discovered and it's not like I have it all solved, but I am on this journey of self-discovery part 2. And that means just being much more true to myself and taking care of myself. The second piece is because I have had this like new lease on life and the fact that I was basically given another shot, I was going to just be much more intentional with all of my choices, which I started to allude to in the first one, but all my choices now are much more deliberate and they're focused with me in mind, and not like self-servingly, but more that I very, very much more carefully considering how I feel in certain kinds of situations, how I make certain types of decisions. I'm allowing myself to be guided by not just my head, which before all this had happened, I was very much head first. And in this universe and in this life, it's not just about being head first. I think I'll say the third one is that I'm just trying to be a much better student of life. So I'm focusing much more on my headspace, on clarity and making sense of things and learning from them, because the reality is that if you're going to go through things and not learn through them, then it was kind of like a wasted experience. So I've kind of view everything after the stroke as a new opportunity to learn and love and appreciate myself. But I even reflect on the experiences before the stroke, and now I see them with a different set of eyes and with different clarity. And I think that that's a clarity that going through such a life altering experience, especially something where you could be at the edge of a very, very scary point of life, I think that that's a benefit and an advantage that I have. And I think why This Life Reconsidered is my platform and my channel for that. I also have an accompanying podcast in which I focused on the big themes and the big educational lessons that came out of stroke survival. So it's not just about being a stroke survivor, but it's just the vantage point and the perspective and the insight that surviving a life-altering event like that gives you. How it is you see the world, how you embrace it, how you live in it, how you move in it, and how you make choices. And there are so many other major headlines that I could say that came out of those experiences, but I don't want to make a video about all of those experiences, because I also need to make videos of the content, videos of all of the journey, and that's the purpose of a channel, so I don't need to kind of dump it all here. But it was ultimately living that experience and going through everything and then going from a drastic point and then getting to another drastic point that is the reason and the rationale for this channel and how I choose to present my truth. So I'm not necessarily just a survivor of, although I am very, very proud, very, very, very unbelievably proud of being a survivor and a very proud one, and just thrilled that I'm here and can tell and can deliver my narrative to other people, especially young survivors of a similar trauma. And I'm glad that I have that ability to kind of share and educate and inspire that it does get better, because it's probably hard to see that when you're living the ordeal, especially, or when you're starting the journey. It is very, very hard. And even later going through the journey, it is hard to kind of feel like you stop thinking about being a survivor, because there's not a day that doesn't pass that I don't get up and think of myself as a survivor. But this channel isn't solely about being a survivor. It's more about the idea of using a life-altering event to serve as empowerment, as a basis for clarity, and as a platform for self-development. Because if there's something else that I've always believed this event has done, it is giving me a chance to reset. So I kind of like to consider this my reset, and my life reset, and that maybe the way that I approach life and live and move in it has now shifted, and I'm okay with that. Anyway, that's kind of my narrative and my story, and I kind of wanted to share that with you and provide that in a much more relaxed and open format, so that you kind of understand why this platform exists and why I hope to inspire and motivate and intrigue and encourage, especially in a world that we're living in right now where we can use all the encouragement that we can possibly get, especially when we're not feeling kind of encouraged and inspired and motivated. And I like to think that that even going through that experience has inspired and energized and encouraged me to look at life from a completely different and maybe a slightly brighter standpoint. I like to say that, the glass is finally starting to look a little half full as opposed to half empty.